The story took place on the streets of Old World Vienna in Europe. A poor boy unexpectedly witnessed a moment of magic that changed his life forever. When Edward was young, he met an old man on the roadside. With a casual wave of his hand, the man seemed to pull a frog from behind Edward's neck. Before Edward could react, the man flicked his wrist and the frog turned into a rose. With another shake, the rose transformed into a flute. The flute slowly floated into the air, and the old man suddenly vanished. Even the large tree beside them disappeared. From that day on, Edward became completely fascinated with magic. He practiced everywhere he went and constantly studied new techniques. During one performance, he caught the attention of a noble girl named Sophie. Sophie could not help but follow him. Edward asked her to pick a card, remember the suit, and return it to the deck. In the next second, he not only found the exact card, but also made it float in mid-air. Sophie watched in total amazement, but because Edward came from a poor background, Sophie's family strictly forbade them from seeing each other. In the following years, Edward still secretly met her at their hidden spot. Sophie always imagined that one day Edward would use magic to make them disappear together. Edward handcrafted a pendant for her. Inside the small capsule was his photograph. It became a token of their love, until one day, they planned to run away together. But Sophie was discovered the moment she slipped out. They hid in their secret place. Sophie said anxiously, "Make us disappear." Edward desperately tried his tricks, but the people chasing them were getting closer. In the end, they were captured. The young lovers were forcibly separated. After that, Edward completely vanished. 15 years later, Edward reappeared in Vienna as a magician hiding his true identity. His performances felt like real magic. He borrowed a handkerchief from the audience and placed it into a box. Then he cut open an orange, removed a seed, and planted it in soil. A shocking scene followed. The seed sprouted and grew rapidly. It became a small tree right before everyone's eyes, and even bore fruit. The audience was stunned. He picked a fruit and handed it down for inspection. Only then did people realize the handkerchief in the box had vanished. When they looked back again, the handkerchief appeared between two butterflies. Edward became famous overnight. Police officers arrived to inspect the scene. Crown Prince Leopold also came after hearing of his reputation. Inspector All, who was in charge of the investigation, was deeply curious about the mechanics of the tricks, and specifically went backstage to look, but a magician's props were his livelihood. So Edward revealed nothing. During the second performance, Edward brought out a massive mirror and invited audience interaction. Prince Leopold introduced his fiancée. The moment Edward saw her, he immediately recognized Sophie. He suppressed his emotions and continued the show. He draped a red cloak over Sophie, guided her to the mirror, and placed a hat on her head. As Edward bowed to the audience, the reflection in the mirror failed to follow his movement. In the next second, another figure suddenly appeared inside the mirror. While nothing stood behind Sophie, the figure raised a knife. The crowd gasped in shock. Edward extended his hand to guide it, and a spirit slowly stepped out of the mirror. He caught it, lifted the cloak, and ended the performance, leaving the entire audience stunned. After the show, Prince Leopold waited for him in the lounge. First, he wanted to confirm his suspicions about the magic. Second, he invited Edward to perform at the palace. Edward accepted the invitation. Before leaving, the prince said coldly, "I will gather the smartest minds to expose your tricks." Sophie seemed to have recognized Edward. That night, Edward received a letter from her. Early the next morning, two carriages stopped side by side. Sophie stepped into Edward's carriage. She recognized him. All these years, she had hoped to see him again. Edward tried to remain calm and stepped out of the carriage. Sophie still wore the pendant he had given her years ago. Inspector All, who was assigned to watch her, learned about their meeting. A new performance began. The prince was convinced he would finally expose the trick. Edward let a blank sheet of paper slowly develop an image. A portrait of the prince's father appeared. The prince stepped forward to inspect it and found no brush marks. He concluded it was done with chemical reactions. He publicly searched Edward's sleeves, but found nothing. Edward said calmly, "Turn on the lights so His Highness can see clearly." Furious and embarrassed, the prince ordered all the props removed and demanded that Edward show real skill on the spot. Edward borrowed the prince's sword and began telling the story of the sword in the stone. It is not the man who chooses the sword, but the sword that chooses the man. The sword appeared loose, yet no one could pull it free. Several young men tried and failed. The pressure shifted to the prince. He stepped forward, but still could not move it. The crowd began to jeer. The prince's face darkened. Edward signaled for him to try again. With a fierce pull, the prince finally drew the sword. The audience erupted in cheers, but the prince looked grim and ended the show early. He realized Edward had humiliated him. He then ordered Inspector All to deal with Edward secretly. Late at night, Sophie rode over to warn Edward. She wanted to help him escape. The two argued and struggled. Edward could no longer suppress his emotions. Meanwhile, the prince was plotting to overthrow his father's rule, and Sophie was merely a pawn in his scheme. Edward urged her to leave with him, but Sophie knew that if they eloped, both families would hunt them down. Memories resurfaced. Years ago, Edward's performance had been forcibly cancelled, and the two were driven out of the theater. Edward gathered all his savings and prepared to leave, but was secretly followed. He met Sophie in secret to plan their future. Yet the entire meeting was watched by spies. After Inspector All learned everything, he quietly reported it to the prince. That same night, Sophie asked the prince to end their engagement. The prince instantly lost his temper and struck her across the face. "You are my fiancée." But for the sake of his plan, he still ordered Sophie to prepare for the wedding. Before leaving, he coldly said, "Goodbye." Drunk and unstable, Prince Leopold suddenly lost control of his emotions. Sophie rushed into the stables in panic, and the prince staggered in after her. Soon, a scream echoed from inside, followed by the terrified cries of horses. A white horse burst out of the stable, dragging Sophie behind it as she suffered severe injuries. The guards at the entrance witnessed everything. Meanwhile, Edward was still waiting outside his home for Sophie to arrive. Early the next morning, the white horse wandered through the streets and eventually returned home. The butler noticed bloodstains on the saddle, and everyone immediately began a large-scale search. With the help of police dogs, they finally found Sophie by the riverside. Edward rushed to her without hesitation, but she had already stopped breathing.